I was 63 years old when I watched my entire life shatter in front of 200 guests, and I didn't shed a single tear. Not one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment I should have known that perfection is just another word for lie. If you've ever stood in a room full of people celebrating your love while your heart whispers that something's wrong, you'll understand what I'm about to tell you. And if you're watching this from wherever you are in the world right now, leave a comment and let me know where you're from. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our pain makes it just a little bit easier to bear. Check the description box below for more stories like mine, because trust me, you're going to want to hear what happens next. My name is Eleanor, and for 40 years, I thought I knew who I was. I was Richard's wife. Mother to our 3 sons, David, Thomas, and James. I was the woman who kept our home in suburban Connecticut running like clockwork, who hosted dinner parties that people talked about for months, who never once questioned whether the man sleeping beside me every night was exactly who he said he was. The day of our 40th anniversary started like any other Saturday in September. The morning sun filtered through our bedroom curtains the way it had for decades, painting stripes of gold across the hardwood floors Richard had installed himself 30 years ago. I remember lying there, watching those patterns shift, thinking about how light can transform everything it touches. I didn't know then that by nightfall, I'd understand just how much darkness that same light could reveal. Richard was already up, humming in the shower. He always hummed when he was in a good mood, this tuneless melody that used to drive me crazy when we were young but had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. I pulled on my robe and went downstairs to start the coffee, my feet knowing every creaking floorboard by memory. Our house was beautiful that morning. I'd spent weeks preparing for the anniversary party. White roses everywhere, because they were what Richard had given me on our wedding day. Caterers were arriving at noon. The rental company had already set up tables in the backyard under a massive white tent. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as I'd planned it. I didn't know that Richard had been planning something too. Something that had been in motion for 23 years. The coffee was brewing when he came downstairs, his hair still damp, wearing the navy suit I'd picked out for him. He looked good for 65. Still had most of his hair, even if it was silver now. Still had that smile that had made me fall in love with him when I was 23 and working as a secretary at the accounting firm where he was a junior partner. He kissed my cheek. His lips were warm, familiar. Real. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about later. How real everything felt even when it was all built on lies. Big day, he said, pouring himself coffee. 40 years. Can you believe it, Elle? I couldn't. 40 years of marriage. 40 years of building a life together. Of raising our boys. Of scraped knees and college graduations and Sunday dinners where everyone talked over each other and laughed until our sides hurt. 40 years of sleeping next to the same person, of knowing how he took his coffee and what made him laugh and which side of the bed he preferred. 40 years of not knowing anything at all. The morning passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. Our sons arrived around 10, David from Boston with his wife Sarah, Thomas from Manhattan with his fiancée Julie, and James from Philadelphia, still stubbornly single at 34. They looked so handsome in their suits, my boys. They hugged me and told me I looked beautiful and helped carry chairs and hung lights and made jokes about how they couldn't believe we'd put up with each other for 4 decades. If you've ever watched your children laugh, completely unaware that their world is about to explode, you know that particular kind of heartbreak. It's the heartbreak of knowing and being powerless to stop what's coming. Of wanting to freeze time in that moment of innocence before everything changes. But I didn't know. Not yet. Not completely. Although, that's not entirely true, is it? Because there were signs. There had always been signs. The business trips that seemed to cluster around the same city. The phone calls he took in another room. The way his smile sometimes didn't quite reach his eyes when he looked at me across the dinner table. The credit card statements that occasionally had charges I didn't recognize, quickly explained away as client dinners or work expenses. I'd made myself blind because seeing would have required action, and action would have shattered the life I'd spent 40 years building. So I'd looked away. I'd smiled and cooked dinner and asked about his day and pretended that the small voice in the back of my mind whispering something's wrong was just paranoia, just insecurity, just me being silly. But that voice knew. That voice had always known. The guests started arriving at 5. Friends we'd known for decades. Richard's colleagues. My book club. Neighbors. Our pastor. They filled the backyard with laughter and champagne toasts and stories about the old days. I floated through the crowd in my silver dress, accepting congratulations, hugging people, playing the role I'd perfected over 40 years. The happy wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who had it all figured out. I remember thinking, as the sun started to set and the string lights flickered on overhead, that this was it. This was the pinnacle of everything we'd built. This moment, with everyone we loved gathered together to celebrate our love. Our success. Our perfectly constructed life. I had no idea that in less than an hour, I was going to discover that the only thing perfect about our life was how perfectly it had all been a lie. The dinner was served at 6:30. Grilled salmon and roasted vegetables and a salad with those candied pecans everyone always raved about. I sat at the head table between Richard and our sons, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Richard's hand was on my knee under the table. He leaned over and whispered that he loved me. His breath was warm against my ear. I believed him. God help me, even with everything I'd suspected, everything I'd pushed down and ignored, I believed him in that moment. The speeches started during dessert. David went first, telling embarrassing stories about growing up with us as parents. Then Thomas, more serious, talking about what our marriage had taught him about commitment. James made everyone laugh with a joke about how we'd somehow tolerated each other for longer than he'd managed to keep a houseplant alive. Everyone was laughing. The champagne was flowing. The cake, a massive 3-tiered creation with white frosting and sugar flowers, sat waiting to be cut. And that's when I saw them. 3 people I'd never seen before, standing at the edge of our property, barely visible in the fading light. A woman about my age, maybe a few years younger. And 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, both tall and awkward in that way teenagers are, dressed nicely but clearly uncomfortable. They were watching the party. Watching us. And Richard had gone completely still beside me. I felt his body tense, felt his hand tighten on my knee. I turned to look at him, and his face had lost all color. He was staring at those 3 strangers with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, not quite resignation, but something in between. Something that looked almost like relief. Richard. I said softly, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Richard, who are those people? He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up. His chair scraped against the ground, cutting through the laughter and conversation. People started to notice, started to turn and look. The noise gradually died down as everyone realized something was happening. Richard straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and then he gestured to the 3 strangers, motioning them forward. They walked toward us slowly, carefully, like they were approaching something dangerous. The woman had red hair, I noticed. The boy looked like he was maybe 15. The girl a year or 2 younger. They reached the edge of the tent, and Richard met them there, putting his hand on the woman's back in a gesture so familiar, so intimate, that I felt something crack inside my chest. Everyone, Richard said, and his voice carried across the suddenly silent backyard. Everyone, I have something to say. Something I should have said a long time ago. Our sons were staring. I was frozen in my seat, my hands gripping the table so hard my knuckles had gone white. 200 people held their collective breath. And that's when Richard said the words that would change everything. Everyone, meet my other family. I've kept this secret for 23 years. The silence that followed those words was absolute. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I watched Richard's mouth move, watched him gesture toward the woman and the teenagers, but for a moment I couldn't process the sounds coming out. It was like my brain had short-circuited, unable to reconcile what I was hearing with the reality I thought I knew. This is Patricia, Richard continued, his voice steady despite the tremor I could see in his hands. And these are our children, Dylan and Emma. They live in Hartford. I've been supporting them, visiting them, being part of their lives for over 2 decades. The woman, Patricia, looked like she wanted to disappear. Her face was flushed, her eyes darting around at all the shocked faces staring at her. The teenagers looked equally miserable, the boy staring at his shoes while the girl seemed close to tears. I should have been shocked. I should have screamed or cried or thrown something. That's what everyone expected. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes swiveling between Richard and me, waiting for the explosion, the breakdown, the dramatic collapse of the betrayed wife. But here's the thing about secrets. Sometimes the person keeping them isn't the only one with something to hide. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my dress. My legs were steady. My hands weren't shaking. I'd had 23 years to prepare for this moment, even if I'd spent most of that time pretending it would never come. Eleanor, Richard started, finally looking at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Everyone, I said, cutting him off, my voice carrying clear and calm across the silent crowd. I want to thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate our anniversary. Richard and I have certainly had an interesting 40 years together. I reached into the small clutch purse I'd kept beside my plate all evening. My fingers found the envelope I'd placed there that morning, the envelope I'd been carrying around in some form or another for longer than Richard had been keeping his secret. Richard, I said, holding out the envelope. I have something for you too. Something I've been saving for the right moment. And I have to say, this moment is just perfect. If you've ever had information that could destroy someone, you know the weight it carries. You know how it sits in your chest, how it whispers to you in quiet moments, how it makes you powerful and terrified all at once. And if you're still watching, if you haven't paused to process what's happening, leave a comment right now. Tell me if you think I was right to wait, to let him think he was the only one with secrets. Check the description box below for the rest of this story and others like it, because what happens next is something I never could have predicted. Richard took the envelope with hands that were visibly trembling now. Our sons had stood up from their seats. David looked angry, Thomas confused, James like he might be sick. The guests were whispering now, a low buzz of shock and speculation rippling through the crowd. Open it, I said quietly. Go ahead. He did. His fingers fumbled with the seal, and I watched his face as he pulled out the contents. First, his expression was confused. Then, as he started to read, understanding dawned. And then his face went completely, utterly pale. The documents in that envelope told a story Richard thought had been buried 25 years ago. They told the story of how he'd embezzled over $200,000 from his own firm when we were young, when we were struggling to make ends meet with 3 small children. They told how he'd covered it up by manipulating accounts and forging signatures. They told how one of the junior partners, a man named Peter Hoffman, had figured it out and confronted him. And they told how Peter Hoffman had died in a convenient car accident 3 weeks later, before he could report Richard to the authorities. Where did you get this? Richard whispered, his face now not just pale but gray, sickly. The papers were shaking in his hands. From Peter's widow, I said calmly. Louise Hoffman. She became a very close friend of mine after her husband's death. Strange how that happens sometimes, isn't it? How tragedy brings people together. What I didn't tell him then, what I told no one in that moment, was that Louise had come to me the day after her husband's funeral, 25 years ago. She'd shown up at my door with a folder full of documents and photographs, her face haggard with grief and rage. Your husband killed mine, she'd said, and then she'd told me everything. How Peter had discovered the embezzlement. How he'd told Louise he was going to confront Richard. How he'd died before he could. How she'd found all his research, all his evidence, hidden in his home office. Why are you telling me this? I'd asked her, and she'd looked at me with eyes so full of pain that I'd felt it like a physical blow. Because you have children, she'd said. Because you have a life. Because if I destroy your husband, I destroy you too, and I can't carry that guilt on top of everything else. But someday, Eleanor, you might need this. Someday, you might need to know who you're really married to. I'd taken the documents. I'd hidden them. And I'd spent the next 25 years watching my husband, waiting, wondering if I'd married a thief or something worse. Wondering if Peter Hoffman's death had really been an accident or if Richard had somehow arranged it. The embezzlement I knew was real. The documents proved it. The murder. That I could never be sure of. But suspicion is its own kind of poison. It had colored every year of our marriage since that day. "You've known," Richard said now, his voice barely audible. "All this time you've known." "Yes," I said simply. "Just like you've known about Patricia and your other children all this time. We've both been keeping secrets, Richard. The only difference is, I was waiting for you to confess. I gave you 40 years to come clean, to trust me with the truth. And you never did." Patricia had started crying. She was holding her daughter, both of them trembling. The boy Dylan was staring at Richard with an expression of confused betrayal. Our sons were frozen in place, looking between their father and me like they didn't recognize either of us. "Mom," David finally said, his voice cracking. "Mom, what is he talking about? Did he steal money? Did he?" "Let your father explain," I said, my voice still steady, still calm. "Let him tell you about the man he really is. About the choices he made. About the life he's been living while we all thought we knew him." Richard looked around at the faces staring at him. His colleagues, his friends, his neighbors, his pastor, his 2 families. He looked at the envelope in his hands, at the evidence of crimes he'd thought were buried forever. He looked at me, and I saw something crumble in his eyes. "I need to sit down," he said weakly. "No," I said, and there was steel in my voice now, steel I hadn't let show in decades. "You wanted to make a grand announcement tonight. You wanted to expose your secret in front of everyone. Well, let's finish what you started. Tell them everything, Richard. Tell them about the money. Tell them about Peter Hoffman. Tell them how you've been living 2 lives for 23 years while the rest of us were living in ignorance. Eleanor, please. Tell them." I shouted, and it was the first time I'd raised my voice all evening. The sound echoed across the backyard, sharp and shocking. "You owe them that much. You owe me that much. 40 years, Richard. 40 years I've waited for you to be honest with me. Well, here's your chance." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at the ground. And in that moment, I saw my husband not as the man I'd thought I loved, but as what he truly was, a coward. A liar. A man who'd built his entire life on deception and never had the courage to face what he'd done. The silence stretched out. One of the guests coughed. Someone's phone started ringing and was quickly silenced. Patricia was whispering urgently to her children, trying to usher them away, but they were rooted in place, unable to look away from the disaster unfolding before them. And then Thomas, my middle son, my quiet one who always thought before he spoke, said the only thing that mattered. "Get out." Richard looked up, startled. "Thomas." "Get out," Thomas repeated, louder now, stepping forward. "I don't care where you go. I don't care what you do. But you don't get to stand here anymore. You don't get to be part of this family anymore. Get out." David nodded, moving to stand beside his brother. "He's right. Just go." James said nothing, but the look on his face said everything. My youngest son, who'd idolized his father, who'd wanted to follow in his footsteps, looked like his entire world had collapsed. Richard looked at me one last time. I think you should listen to your sons," I said quietly. "Our sons. The ones you raised. Unlike the ones you kept hidden." He left. He actually left. Walked out of our backyard, out of the party celebrating our anniversary, out of the life we'd built together. Patricia and her children followed, hurrying after him, and I heard car doors slamming and engines starting and then the sound fading into the distance. 200 guests stood in shocked silence, and I realized I was still holding my champagne glass. I raised it slightly, and somehow, impossibly, I smiled. "Well," I said, "I suppose we should cut the cake." The weeks that followed were a blur of lawyers and phone calls and questions I didn't want to answer. The party had dissolved immediately after Richard left. People had gathered their things and fled our backyard like the house was on fire, offering awkward condolences and avoiding my eyes. Our sons had stayed, of course. They'd helped the caterers pack up, had taken down decorations in grim silence, had sat with me in the kitchen at midnight drinking coffee and trying to process what had happened. "Did you really know?" David had asked me that night, his voice hollow. About the embezzlement? About all of it. About the money, yes, I told him. About Patricia and the other children. I suspected. 4 years, I suspected. But I could never prove it, and part of me didn't want to know for sure. I didn't tell them about Louise Hoffman's accusations regarding Peter's death. Some secrets were too dark to share with your children, even grown ones. Some suspicions were too terrible to speak aloud. They'd been angry with me at first. Angry that I'd kept Richard's theft hidden, that I'd stayed married to him knowing what he'd done. But as the days passed and more details emerged, as we discovered the full extent of his double life, the lies upon lies, they began to understand. They began to see that I'd been trapped just like they had, caught in a web of deception that had started long before any of us had realized. The embezzlement investigation had been reopened, of course. The statute of limitations had long since passed, but the publicity was devastating. Richard's reputation, carefully built over 40 years, crumbled in a matter of days. His firm had fired him immediately. Friends stopped calling. The story had been picked up by local news, then state media, and suddenly everyone in Connecticut knew about Richard Morrison and his secret life. Patricia had called me once, 2 weeks after the anniversary party. I'd answered, though I wasn't sure why. I didn't know, she'd said, her voice tight with emotion. About the embezzlement, about Peter Hoffman. Richard told me he was divorced from you. He said you were. He said it was complicated, but that you'd agreed to stay legally married for financial reasons while living separate lives. I wouldn't have. I would never have. How did you meet? I'd asked, cutting through her excuses. I didn't want her apologies or her justifications. I wanted to understand. There was a long pause. Then, at a hospital. My daughter, my oldest daughter from my first marriage, was sick. Leukemia. Richard was there visiting a colleague. We started talking in the cafeteria. He was kind. He listened. And when Emma died 6 months later, he was there for me in a way my ex-husband had never been. Emma, I'd said softly. You named your daughter after her. Yes. Patricia's voice broke. My second Emma. Richard wanted. He wanted to honor her memory. We'd been together a year when I got pregnant with Dylan. Richard said he couldn't leave you, that you'd had a nervous breakdown and needed him, but that he loved me and wanted to be a father to our children. I believed him. God, I was such a fool. We both were, I'd said, and then I'd hung up. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from scratch in your 60s, you know how exhausting it is. You know how every choice feels monumental, how every day requires more energy than you think you have. But you also know that there's a strange freedom in it, in letting go of the life you thought you had and starting to build something real. If you're still with me, if you're invested in how this story ends, leave a comment. Tell me about a time you had to start over. Check the description below for more stories about second chances and unexpected endings. I'd filed for divorce immediately. Richard had tried to fight it at first, had sent lawyers with offers of settlements and pleas for reconciliation. But the documents I had, the evidence Louise Hoffman had given me all those years ago, made negotiation impossible. He'd stolen money from his firm. He'd covered up a crime. And while I couldn't prove he'd had anything to do with Peter Hoffman's death, the implication was enough to terrify him. He'd signed whatever I'd put in front of him. The house became mine. The savings accounts, the retirement funds, the vacation property in Maine we'd bought when the kids were young, all mine. Richard moved into a small apartment in Hartford, close to Patricia and their children, and I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd taken a job as a bookkeeper at a small accounting firm, a humiliating step down from the senior partner position he'd lost. My sons had been processing everything in their own ways. David was angry, at Richard, at me, at the whole situation. He'd thrown himself into his work, stopped returning calls as often. Thomas had become introspective, questioning everything he thought he knew about relationships and trust. His engagement to Julie had been put on hold while he worked through his feelings. And James. James had surprised me. He'd shown up at my house one evening in October, a month after the anniversary party, carrying a bottle of wine and a folder of his own. I hired a private investigator, he'd said, sitting down at my kitchen table. After everything came out about Dad, I wanted to know. I needed to know everything. What else he might have been hiding. My heart had sunk. James. Mom, he's been gambling. James had opened the folder, spreading out bank statements and photographs and credit card bills. 4 years. I found records going back almost 15 years. Casinos, online betting, sports books. He's lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. I'd stared at the documents, feeling numb. Another secret. Another lie. How many more were there? How much of my marriage had been real? There's more, James had said quietly. The car accident. Peter Hoffman's car accident. My blood had gone cold. What about it? I got the police reports. The original investigation. Mom, they found evidence that the brake lines had been tampered with, but the case was dropped. There was a note in the file. Someone high up pressured them to call it an accident and close the investigation. I can't prove Dad was involved in either part of that, but the timing was too convenient. The motive too clear. And Richard's connections in the community, his friendship with local politicians and police officials, would have made a cover-up possible. Louise Hoffman knew, I'd whispered. She tried to tell me, but I was too afraid to believe her. James had reached across the table and taken my hand. You survived this, Mom. You survived 40 years with a man who was a complete stranger. That makes you the strongest person I know. But I didn't feel strong. I felt old and tired and foolish. I felt like I'd wasted my entire adult life on someone who had never truly existed. The holidays had been strange that year. Our first Thanksgiving without Richard at the head of the table. Our first Christmas without his terrible jokes and his insistence on reading "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" aloud even though our sons were all adults. The house had felt empty in a way it never had before, even when the boys were away at college. But something shifted during those cold winter months. David started calling more often, his anger softening into something more like understanding. Thomas had set a new wedding date, had told me he'd realized that his parents' broken marriage didn't mean his own was doomed. And James had moved back home for a few months, claiming he wanted to save money on rent but really just wanting to make sure I was okay. I'd started seeing a therapist in January. Dr. Sarah Chun was patient and kind and didn't judge me for staying as long as I had or for keeping Richard's secret all those years. She'd helped me understand that survival sometimes means compromise, that self-preservation isn't the same as cowardice. You were protecting your children, she told me during one session. You were protecting the life you'd built. That's not weakness, Eleanor. That's love. I'd cried then, finally, months after the anniversary party. I'd cried for the girl I'd been at 23, who'd fallen in love with a charming young accountant and thought she was building a fairy tale. I'd cried for all the years I'd looked the other way, all the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I was crazy for feeling like something was wrong. I'd cried for Peter Hoffman, whose death might have been on my conscience if I'd spoken up sooner about the embezzlement. But mostly, I'd cried from relief. Because the truth, no matter how ugly, was better than living in that constant state of uncertainty and fear. Spring came, and with it, unexpected news. Patricia had left Richard. She'd taken Dylan and Emma and moved back to her hometown in Vermont, filing for full custody and child support. She'd released a statement through her lawyer saying she'd been deceived just as much as I had, that she'd believed Richard's lies about our marriage being over in all but paperwork. Richard had lost both his families in less than 6 months. I should have felt vindicated. Satisfied. Some kind of dark pleasure in watching him lose everything the way I'd lost everything. But all I felt was empty. Tired. Ready for this chapter of my life to be finally truly over. And then, on a rainy afternoon in April, Louise Hoffman knocked on my door. Louise looked older than I remembered, though it had been 25 years since I'd last seen her. Her hair was completely white now, cut short and practical. She was wearing a simple blue dress and carrying an umbrella, and when I opened the door, she smiled at me with an expression of such profound sadness that I nearly closed the door again. I know I should have called first, she said. But I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me. And I needed. Eleanor, I needed to tell you something. Something I should have told you 25 years ago. I let her in. Made tea. We sat in my living room, the same living room where I'd spent 40 years playing the perfect wife, and she told me the truth I'd been afraid to know all along. Peter wasn't planning to report Richard's embezzlement to the authorities, Louise began, her hands wrapped around her teacup for warmth. He was planning to blackmail him. I stared at her, not understanding. What? My husband was a gambling addict, Louise said quietly. He'd gotten himself into serious debt with some very dangerous people. When he discovered Richard's theft, he saw it as an opportunity. He confronted Richard, yes, but not to do the right thing. He wanted money to pay off his debts. A lot of money. The room felt like it was tilting. But you told me Richard killed him. I thought he had, Louise interrupted. Peter told me he was going to confront Richard, and then he died 3 weeks later. I assumed. I was so angry, so grief-stricken, I put 2 and 2 together and got 5. I gave you those documents because I wanted someone else to know what Richard was capable of, but I was too afraid to go to the police myself because I knew Peter's own crimes would come out too. Then who? I couldn't finish the question. The people he owed money to, Louise said, and her voice cracked. I found out later, years later. Peter's death wasn't an accident, but it wasn't Richard either. It was the loan sharks he'd been dodging. They'd tampered with his brakes as a warning, but the warning went too far. He was dead before they meant him to be, and they'd lost their chance to collect what he owed them. I set down my teacup before I dropped it. Why are you telling me this now? Because I saw what happened at your anniversary party, Louise said. The news coverage, the investigation being reopened. I saw what I'd started with my accusations and my implications. Eleanor, Richard is a thief and a liar and probably a dozen other terrible things. But he's not a murderer. And you deserve to know that. You deserve to know the full truth after all these years. If you've ever built your entire revenge on a foundation of assumptions, only to discover that foundation was cracked from the beginning, you know the feeling I had in that moment. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even disappointment. It was something more complicated, a mixture of anger and sadness and a strange kind of grief for the simple narrative I'd been carrying all these years. I spent 25 years thinking I was married to someone who'd killed a man, I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. I carried that weight. I let it poison everything, let it justify staying quiet about the embezzlement, let it color every interaction I had with Richard. And it wasn't even true. I'm sorry, Louise whispered. I'm so sorry. I was a grieving widow looking for someone to blame besides my dead husband, and I made you complicit in my pain. She left shortly after that, slipping back out into the rain. I sat alone in my living room for hours, watching the afternoon fade into evening, trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I knew. Richard was a thief. That was true. He'd embezzled money from his firm, had built his life on stolen foundations. He'd lied to me for decades, had maintained a second family, had gambled away fortunes that should have been ours. He'd betrayed me in every way a person could be betrayed. But he hadn't killed anyone. And that distinction, I realized, mattered more than I'd thought it would. I called him that night. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. Eleanor. We need to talk, I said. In person. Tomorrow. The coffee shop on Main Street. There was a long pause. Okay, he said finally. I'll be there. We met at 10 in the morning. Richard looked terrible. Older, thinner, his silver hair unkempt, his clothes rumpled. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me with the careful movements of a man afraid he might break something. Louise Hoffman came to see me, I said without preamble. She told me the truth about her husband's death. Richard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, understanding, relief, and then something that might have been shame. I didn't kill him, he said quietly. I know what people thought, what you thought, but I didn't. I couldn't have. I know that now, I said. But you were going to let him blackmail you. You were willing to pay him off to keep your theft quiet. Yes, Richard admitted. I was terrified. I'd stolen the money to cover gambling debts I'd hidden from you. Then I'd stolen more to cover the theft. It was a spiral I couldn't get out of. When Peter found out, I thought my life was over. And then he died, and the investigation went away, and I thought I'd been given a second chance. You didn't take it though, I said. You kept gambling. You started a second family. You built lie after lie until you'd constructed an entire false life. I know. His voice was barely audible. Elle, I know there's nothing I can say that will make this right. Nothing I can do to undo the damage. But I need you to understand, I loved you. I still love you. Everything I did, every lie I told, it was because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd become. I thought I could control it, keep all the pieces separate, make it work somehow. But it didn't work, I said. It couldn't have worked. Real life isn't something you can manage and compartmentalize. Real love isn't something you can split between two families and expect to survive. Check the description box below for the conclusion of this story and others like it, because what I'm about to tell you next changed everything about how I saw revenge, justice, and my own role in this complicated mess. I don't expect you to forgive me, Richard said. I don't even expect you to understand. But I needed to tell you. Patricia and we're done. The kids won't speak to me, Dylan, Emma, any of them. David, Thomas, James. I've lost everyone, and it's exactly what I deserve. But Elle, I'm getting help. Real help. Therapy, Gamblers Anonymous, all of it. I know it's too late for us, but I'm trying to become someone who isn't a complete disappointment. I looked at this man I'd spent 40 years with, this stranger wearing my husband's face, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, pity. Not forgiveness, I wasn't sure I'd ever get there. But pity for someone who'd destroyed his own life so thoroughly that there was nothing left but ruins. I'm not going to pursue the embezzlement investigation further, I told him. The statute of limitations has passed anyway, and dragging it all through the courts won't give me back the years you stole. But Richard, I need you to understand something. I didn't expose you at that party for revenge. I did it because you forced my hand. You stood up in front of everyone we knew and revealed your secret family, and you didn't give me a choice about how to respond. I know, he said. I was trying to come clean, trying to finally be honest, but I did it in the most cowardly way possible. I made it public so you couldn't have a private reaction, so you'd have to be composed and controlled in front of all those people. I realize now how cruel that was. Why? I asked. Why that night? Why at our anniversary party? Richard was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee absently. Patricia's daughter, Emma. She'd asked me why she couldn't come to family gatherings. Why she had to be a secret. She was 13 years old, and she was starting to understand what it meant that I had this whole other life she wasn't part of. And I looked at her, this kid who'd never asked to be born into this mess, and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep lying. But I also couldn't face telling you privately, couldn't handle the intimacy of that betrayal. So I did it publicly, thinking somehow that would make it easier. It didn't, I said flatly. No, he agreed. It made everything infinitely worse. We sat in silence for a while. The coffee shop filled up with the late morning crowd, young mothers with strollers, students with laptops, retirees reading newspapers. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of secrets and lies we'd been carrying. I want you to have a relationship with Dylan and Emma, I said finally, and Richard's head snapped up in surprise. Not because I've forgiven you or because I think you deserve it, but because they're children who didn't choose any of this. They deserve to have a father who shows up, even if that father is flawed and broken. Our boys are adults. They'll decide for themselves whether they want you in their lives. But those kids, they need someone. Patricia won't. Patricia will do what's best for her children, I interrupted. And whether she admits it or not, having their father present is better than having him completely absent. You don't get to use your shame as an excuse to abandon them the way you abandoned all of us emotionally for decades. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Why are you being kind to me, after everything I've done? I'm not being kind to you, I said. I'm being kind to them. There's a difference. And Richard? This is the last time you and I are going to have a conversation like this. The divorce will be final in a few months. After that, we're done. You don't get to call me when you're struggling. You don't get to use our history as a way to stay connected. We're over. Completely. He nodded, wiping his eyes. I understand. I stood up, gathering my purse. I hope you do get better, I said. Not for me or for us, but for yourself. Because the man you've been for the last 40 years, that's not someone anyone should have to be. I left him sitting there and walked out into the spring morning. The air smelled like rain and new growth, like the world was being washed clean and starting over. I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years. Not happy exactly, but free. Finally, truly free. The months that followed were a process of rediscovery. I'd spent so much of my life defining myself in relation to Richard, as his wife, as the mother of his children, as the keeper of his secrets, that I'd forgotten who Eleanor was on her own. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before the kids were born. My house slowly filled with canvases, abstract pieces in bold colors that had nothing to do with the muted, controlled palette I'd maintained for decades. My sons came to visit and were startled by the transformation, by their mother wearing paint-splattered jeans instead of tasteful slacks, by the music playing loudly through the house, by the genuine smile on my face. David and I had a long conversation one evening in June. He'd been the angriest of my sons, the one who'd felt most betrayed by my silence about Richard's crimes. But he'd also been doing his own therapy, working through his feelings about family and loyalty and what we owe the people who hurt us. I think I understand now, he'd said, sitting on my back porch with a beer. Why you stayed quiet. You were trying to protect us, to give us a normal childhood even though nothing about our family was normal. I was also protecting myself, I'd admitted. I was afraid of being alone, afraid of starting over, afraid of admitting I'd made a mistake marrying your father. The thing about staying in a bad situation is that eventually, you become invested in making it work, even when it can't. Are you happier now? He'd asked. I'd thought about it carefully before answering. I'm not happier, I'd said finally. But I'm more honest. And maybe that's more important. Thomas got married in August. It was a small ceremony, nothing like the elaborate affair he and Julie had originally planned. But it was beautiful in its simplicity, close friends and family, a garden venue, vows that were clearly written from the heart. Richard hadn't been invited, and I'd been grateful for that small mercy. I'd watched my son marry the woman he loved, and I'd thought about my own wedding 40-some years ago. I'd been so young, so certain that love was enough to build a life on. I knew better now. Love wasn't enough. You also needed honesty, trust, respect, all the things Richard and I had never truly had. James had moved into his own apartment by fall, though he still came by for dinner twice a week. He'd started dating someone, a kind, funny man named Alex who made him laugh in a way I'd never seen before. My youngest son was finding himself, figuring out who he was outside of the shadow of his father's betrayals. Are you okay with this? James had asked nervously when he'd first introduced me to Alex. I know you're from a different generation, and I know with everything that's happened with Dad. I'm okay with anything that makes you happy, I told him honestly. After 40 years of lies, the only thing I want from my children is authenticity. Be who you are, love who you love, and don't ever hide it from the people who matter. It's been 3 years now since that anniversary party. 3 years since my life exploded in front of 200 guests. 3 years since I learned that sometimes the revenge you think you want isn't as satisfying as the freedom you didn't know you needed. Richard is still in Hartford, still working his small bookkeeper job. I hear updates occasionally through mutual acquaintances. He's still in therapy, still attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. He has limited visitation with Dylan and Emma, supervised at first but now more regular. Patricia apparently moved back to Connecticut last year, decided the kids needed to be near their father even if the relationship was complicated. Our sons see him occasionally, on their own terms. David goes to lunch with him every few months. Thomas sends birthday cards. James is still processing, still deciding what kind of relationship, if any, he wants with his father. And me? I'm 66 now. I sold the big house in Connecticut and bought a smaller place in Maine, near the vacation property I'd kept in the divorce. I paint every day. I've joined a book club. I volunteer at the local library. I've even started dating, though nothing serious yet. I've learned that revenge isn't always the dramatic confrontation you see in movies. Sometimes revenge is just living well. Sometimes it's taking back your life, piece by piece, and building something authentic from the ruins of what was false. I think about that envelope I handed Richard sometimes. I think about how I'd carried it around for years, this weapon I could deploy at any moment. I'd thought it made me powerful, made me safe. But really, it had just made me afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I used it, afraid of what would happen if I didn't. The truth is, I should have confronted Richard decades ago. I should have demanded honesty when I first suspected his infidelity, when Louise Hoffman first came to me with her accusations. I should have protected myself and my children instead of protecting the illusion of a perfect marriage. But I can't change the past. None of us can. All we can do is decide who we want to be moving forward. If you've made it this far in my story, if you've stayed with me through all the twists and revelations and complicated truths, I want to thank you. Sharing this has been difficult, but also cathartic. It's helped me process everything that happened, helped me see my own role in the disaster my marriage became. And if there's one lesson I want you to take from this, it's this: don't wait for the perfect moment to live authentically. Don't stay in a situation that's slowly killing your spirit because you're afraid of what change might bring. Don't keep secrets that poison everything they touch. Life is too short to spend it living someone else's lie. I hope wherever you're watching from, whatever country, whatever city, whatever small town or big metropolis, you'll remember that it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to demand the truth, even when the truth is ugly and painful and destroys everything you thought you knew. Leave a comment and tell me where you're from. Tell me if you've ever had to start over. Tell me about the secrets you've carried and the freedom you found when you finally let them go. And check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories about betrayal and survival and the complicated ways we hurt and heal each other. Stories about real people facing impossible choices and finding their way through to the other side. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Face the impossible, survive it, and find our way to the other side. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, no matter how long you've been living in the darkness, it's never too late to step into the light.